I want you to meet Bobby Cox. He's a former Army Ranger. He says he's leaning toward Governor Bush, but he's still undecided. Bobby?
Good evening, sir. Thanks for coming out to Greenville here. By way of background, I attended the Citadel down in Charleston, South Carolina. Yeah, great school. And then during my senior year, the actual 9/11 attacks occurred. And then upon graduation, I went into the Army. And I actually deployed 4 times to Iraq. And so during that time that we were in Iraq, we really felt like we were putting the Iraqi government on a stable ground. Yeah. But fast forward a couple years later, when the actual cities that we had actually fought to protect with so much effort, time, and blood were actually retaken by ISIS. And so, there was a frustration there where a lot of my men thought that their time had been squandered overseas based upon really the lack of the U.S. political will to really see victory. Yeah. So I want to ask you, as a commander-in-chief, if you take on that mantle of leadership, what would you do to ensure that the service members and their families, their sacrifices during a time of war, are not wasted, as we've seen in the past?
Well, Bobby, let me say, first of all, thank you for your service and sacrifice. Thank you for defending this nation. And your question is incredibly important. As I travel South Carolina, I meet every day active duty military. I meet every day veterans who are so unhappy with the direction we're going right now. For 7 years, we've had a commander-in-chief who doesn't believe in the mission of the military, who doesn't stand by them, who has weakened and degraded the military in a way that it's undermined readiness and made us far less able to defend ourselves. Yesterday, here in South Carolina, I rolled out a comprehensive plan to rebuild the military, to restore the strength that we need to defend ourselves. And, if you think about the last time our military was badly weakened, it was 1980. It was following the Jimmy Carter administration, another weak Democratic president who undermined the military. And when Reagan came in, what Reagan did is he started with tax reform and regulatory reform. He lifted the burdens on small businesses. That unchained the American free enterprise system. It produced incredible, booming economic growth. That growth, in turn, that provided trillions in new federal revenue. Reagan invested that revenue in rebuilding the military, and by doing so, bankrupted the Soviet Union and won the Cold War. We need a president in 2017 who does the exact same thing with regard to radical Islamic terrorism. That is what I intend to do, is start with tax reform and regulatory reform, unleash the American economy, and use that economic growth to rebuild the military. So, for example, as you know, President Obama has proposed reducing the regular Army to 450,000. I think that is far below what is needed to keep this country safe. I intend to increase it to a minimum of 525,000 soldiers. Likewise, the Air Force. The Air Force has been reduced down to about 4,000 planes. We need to increase that to a minimum of 6,000 planes so that we can project power and use our air power superiority. The Navy. We've got 272 ships. The least we've had since 1917, literally a century ago, was the last time we had a Navy with this few ships. We need to increase that to a minimum of 350 ships. And we need an overall force level of 1.4 million troops at a minimum. In addition to that, we need to dramatically expand missile defense. As we see asymmetric threats, as we see rogue nations, we need to be able to defend ourselves. We need to expand cyber defense. But we also need to focus our foreign policy and military policy on identifying and defeating the real enemies. I've got strong disagreements with the mistakes of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy the last 7 years. One perfect example is Libya. Libya, President Obama and Hillary Clinton led the world in toppling the government in Libya, and sadly, they were supported by more than a few establishment Republicans, including several who are running for president. That has proven to be a catastrophic mistake. Toppling the government in Libya meant we handed that country over to radical Islamic terrorists. It's now a chaotic war zone where ISIS and other radical Islamic terrorists pose an acute national security threat to this country. And it led directly, the failures of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy led directly to the tragedy of Benghazi. Rather than engaging in trying to topple governments in the Middle East and nation build, I think the focus of the military needs to be defending this country, protecting our national security interests. So what should we be doing? And by the way, many of those same folks, Obama, Hillary, and those same Republicans, are now saying we should do the same thing in Syria. Topple Assad, And if we do that, the same result is going to happen. If we topple Assad, Assad's a bad man. But if we topple Assad, ISIS will take over Syria. That is worse for America. Instead of getting in the middle of civil wars, we ought to be focusing on the enemies of America. We ought to be utterly destroying ISIS. We ought to be using overwhelming air power. We ought to be arming the Kurds. We ought to be using the tools we have to utterly and completely destroy them. And I'll say a couple of things also. When it comes to the men and women of the military, I don't think the military should be governed by political criticism, should be used for social experiments. So, for example, if I am elected president, we will not be drafting our daughters into combat on the front lines. I was astonished 2 debates ago when 3 different Republican candidates for president stood up and supported drafting women into combat. I think that doesn't make any sense. As I was sitting there listening to it, I kind of wondered if Rod Serling was going to walk out in a second and say, "You've entered the twilight zone." Look, I'm the father of 2 daughters. Women can do anything. But the idea that the federal government would forcibly conscript young women and put them into combat, that makes no sense at all. Another one of the most shameful things that I think of the last 7 years is that we are sending our servicemen and women into combat with rules of engagement that have their arms tied behind their back, that have it impossible for them to fight and defend themselves and win. I think that is immoral. It is wrong. And I will tell you this, I give you my word as Commander-in-Chief, that will end on January 20th, 2017.
Just a quick follow-up. Donald Trump has said that George W. Bush didn't keep this country safe because 9/11 happened on his watch. What did you think when you heard that?
I thought it was ridiculous. I thought it was really painful. Listen, I like Donald. I am not going to engage in personal attacks. But I think his policy positions have not made any sense. When he stood up and defended impeaching George W. Bush, that was his position. George W. Bush should have been impeached. Listen, I'm a constitutionalist. My entire adult life has been spent defending the Constitution, defending the Bill of Rights. The standard for impeachment is high crimes and misdemeanors. He had no argument that George Bush committed any high misdemeanors. He just said on the stage, it was a mistake. You know what? You don't impeach people for things you say are a mistake. And at the time that Donald Trump was promoting impeachment, look, those were the views of the Michael Moores, of the extreme fever swamps of the left. And I have to say, to see on a Republican presidential stage a candidate suggesting we should have impeached George W. Bush, I think that really draws into question the judgment of that candidate to be commander-in-chief.